Welcome to the Latin Playground, where we delve into the nature of language, the nuances of Neo-Latin, and the spiritual experiences of the scientist and mystic Emanuel Swedenborg. Never heard of Neo-Latin or Swedenborg? No problem. Come learn alongside us as we explore the inextricable link between spiritual revelation and grammar. All right, so I'm Chelsea Odhner, and I'm here with Dr. Jonathan Rose. Hi, Jonathan.
Hi there. How are you?
Good. I'm very happy to be here and specifically to talk to you about this new podcast series that I've kind of roped you into. It just sort of evolved. We could talk about how it evolved. That's called
Sure.
the Latin Playground. And it's going to be coming out in January 2025, starting to release episodes. And we'll see how long we go for. But so really what this podcast is, it came about actually because we have some interest, in our staff and in the publishing staff actually, who are independently very interested in Latin. And that was like such a perfect fit because we are probably we're a unique organization at the Swedenborg Foundation that we are so into Latin translation because Swedenborg wrote in Neo-Latin. And so a huge part of what we do and what you do is translate Swedenborg's books into modern accessible English. And there is this risk that unless we keep, interest and knowledge alive around not just Latin, Latin itself isn't going anywhere, but specifically Swedenborg's Neo-Latin, people who really get what that is and understand what's involved in translating Swedenborg's Neo-Latin it's like this interesting critical facet to everything we do. And so it's sort of this idea for this podcast grew out of us thinking, hey, let's do a little bit of a Latin study together. Let's study Latin. Let's get you to teach us some Latin, but let's not just keep that to ourselves. Let's share it. Let's do this Latin study together and share it publicly through a podcast. And you might think, is that not the best fodder, for a podcast? But the thing is, when we are interfacing with Swedenborg's Neo-Latin, it's not just language translation, it's spiritual wisdom language translation. You just get into some really amazing stuff. And so I'd love to hear from you right now about what it was like for you to be, invited, the whole prospect of the Latin Playground. And then, we'll go from there, but I'd love to hear about and share with folks what Latin translation is like for you, and specifically, what's kept you in the game so long. Clearly you've got some staying power that you've been translating Latin for many years now, and clearly it feeds you or you wouldn't be doing it. So we want to know.
There's, as with so many things that Swedenborg talks about, there feels like there are multiple levels to it. Just the level of what you might call earthly language of English, Latin, other languages, they're so fascinating and there's something endless about them. Each language is a little world unto itself, and it takes a long time to get to know a language. And it's so interesting that even when you grow up speaking a language, that doesn't mean you have an analytical understanding of why you place that adverb before or after this other, modal verb or something. And so the analysis of language is an additional layer. Just the way that words interact and how they put demands on each other. The one word will say, well, look, I need you to be this way, because I'm here. You need to change case, or you need to change your ending, or do something differently. And seeing how different the worlds of Latin and English are has been really endlessly interesting to me. But then getting into the additional levels of where Swedenborg is using language to talk about things that he himself says over and over again transcend language.
Yeah.
I was just editing a passage where Swedenborg says that uh, the highest angels can't understand what goes on in the mind of God, and the angels next down below those really can't get hardly anything out of what the highest angels say because they don't comprehend it. They're on a different level, and then that comes down to the next layer of angels, and then spirits below that, and then comes down to the human world. And Swedenborg says that when he's interacting with angels, and I know that's a big jump right there,
Yeah.
but when he's interacting with angels, he can understand what they're saying, and he's in the conversation and getting a lot out of it. He says that they communicate visually as well as telepathically and verbally in various different ways. Doesn't use the word telepathic,
Hmm.
but without words, that sort of thing. Um, but when he comes back down to his office, so to speak,
Yeah.
uh, to try to write it down, he says he not only doesn't have words to express what just happened, but he can't even think it
Oh,
anymore. It's outside
oh
the realm of his
no.
own thought, except for something very vague, like this very vague outline. Well, that's a very humble thing for a person to say who's spending thousands of pages writing about his spiritual experiences. And
Yes.
I'm particularly interested in some of these episodes of the podcast, we got into Swedenborg's language and Swedenborg's language about spiritual language and about what lies behind language and where a lot of our expressions come from. Swedenborg says that just the idioms in
Mhm.
languages come from the presence of the spiritual world, even though we don't realize it. And when he sees on the other side, he can see this connection. So all of that really interests me. Another thing that drew me to the Latin playground and that idea was that I've just had this desire for a long time to sit down with people and just read Latin, just pound through
Yeah.
this together and look at it. Partly because when I was in graduate school, getting my PhD, the sitting with the professors, I could get something of their ability with language because they're communicating about it. And then I could see sort of aha moments when I'm looking at the text. It would help
Yeah.
me get a little leg up or something. And so I've wanted to pass that forward, give that to other people, hopefully, who knows, but wanting to get into it with people and look at it with people in the hopes that maybe they can see ahead of the level that they're at, but they can see it by looking at the text. And I can't speak for the other people who have been part of this experiment, but I have felt like that's happened.
Yes.
Thing happens when we do. I find it very joyful too, frankly. Just there's something about it always energizes me. I love the pace because even with editing
Yes.
and translating, even though it's so slow to go through line by line, it's still Latin Playground is slower. That doesn't sound like a good advertisement for it, but we really look at everything. What are the words doing in relation to each other, and it yields it bears fruit. It
Yeah.
yields insights that you just don't get driving at quote unquote highway
Yeah.
speed.
Yes. That's totally what we've found. And like, I love that, uh, it, you all, even though, yes, and we're dependent on you with your technical understanding of like, well, this is the genitive or this is the a positive. I don't know. I'm not even remembering all the words. There's a lot of technical understanding you do need to have in order to translate Swedenborg's Latin. But when we get to sit beside you and point all that out, we're kind of breaking it down, and it's almost like the physical stuff falls away, right? And then we're just left with like the ideas themselves hanging in the air. And we're like, what is what is being communicated here? And it's so magical feeling that we're all being led into this like idea space. of these very like critical, I mean, and mind blowing, nature of spiritual reality stuff. And like, and that is just kind of what happens when you take your time sitting with just the sentence structure, the specific sentence that he said. So we're not talking, you maybe read a book of Swedenborg's, you've maybe read a passage of Swedenborg's, spent time with like one of those verses in verselets in like Secrets of Heaven where he's talking about one verse and what does it mean. We're taking Swedenborg, an individual sentence or a couple of
Oh,
sentences,
it's true.
and just spending time with the ideas that are packed in there. And it's a different vantage point on Swedenborg. There's like different ways you can connect with what he wrote, and it's like a new one. I think of how when we did the Inside Off the Left Eye podcast, we would do our NCE spotlight. And you talked about how you would sometimes feel like you would get a spiritual sunburn from like your Latin translating because you're like, you're right at, you're front of the plane. You're like sitting at the furnace. I feel like it's like we're going into the fire itself, together in these podcast episodes, to where that alchemical, magic
Mm.
metal smithing is happening itself, with like the power of the word and language. There's language kind of is inherently spiritual. And that's kind of what we realize by connecting with Swedenborg's writing at this level. And yeah, so like in the podcast, we go through a specific passage. We kind of look under the hood because we've even looked at Swedenborg's own first drafts of his handwriting of these texts, so we can see
That's right.
him trying to get the words right. What did that mean for him? Like he struggled, like you described, to put these things into words, and you see that on his handwritten manuscript. So then that's fun and interesting. It feels a bit like we get to go alongside Swedenborg when we break it down to this level. Like he's translating from his spiritual experiences, and then we're translating from the Latin to the English. And you kind of have to go slow because there's so much packed in there, you know?
Yes, and the passages that as I edit, I underline these gems. I use different colors as I'm editing, and so I'll use one color for there's an issue here. Maybe we should look at this or research it, and a different color for I love this. And sometimes write things in the margin. I use green, purple for the former, and green for the gems, and and so out of those gems is where a number of these have come, when especially gems that are about language, about spiritual language, how language works. I thought it would be interesting to look at Swedenborg's language about language and about spiritual
Yes.
language. And that
Yeah.
isn't the only topic that we cover, but that's a focus of a number of the episodes.
Right. Yeah.
And it feels to me, the image that I'm getting from this is that in the volume that I've just been editing, Secrets of Heaven, Volume 12, the Ten Commandments are delivered, and it's very dramatic. God comes down on the mountain, and there's thunder
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
lightning, and the mountain is covered in smoke, and it's something divine coming all the way down and then touching something of the earth, and I feel like there's something of that when you look at this spiritual content coming right down into the ablative and the passive
Yes.
voice, and it's coming
Yes.
right down to these earthly language and these terms. And
Yeah.
so it's fun, and it does feel a little bit, although we lighthearted about it, it feels like sacred ground. It's
Right.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
powerful.
It is. Yeah. I think that's what's fun about, just calling it the Latin playground, because like you can easily
Yes.
think, oh, we're talking about Latin. Like this is just going to feel like being in school or being lectured about like, right, memorizing your declensions, or whatever. Like it's not, there's, so there is something playful about it. And yet just like that, there's something heavenly or even sacred, awe-inspiring, like just so profound when and there's something about doing that with a shared group of people. Like, so there's
Yes.
4 or 5 of us in each of these episodes, and we're learning and asking you questions. And so then I'm excited to be releasing the episodes, because then it's going to just expand that sense of like collective sort of community connection to these, to getting into that sphere. It just kind of feels like a sphere all unto its own. Like,
Yes, and we're all people who work for the Swedenborg Foundation, but some have had a high degree, as you mentioned earlier, of exposure to Swedenborg and the things that he writes and so on. And some are really pretty new, like measure it in months or
yes, yeah,
year or something, and just getting their feet wet and that, and yet we're all motivated and interested, and so that makes for a very interesting conversation. I really enjoy it.
yeah. It's a different way of interfacing with Swedenborg's ideas, and from the get-go. Like a lot of people maybe have heard of Swedenborg, and so then they might get interested in studying his Latin. But isn't that interesting if your entryway to Swedenborg is just through studying his Latin, and like this is going to be an interesting new exposure for people. And so it's not just for people who've been reading Swedenborg forever. This is very much like you could be brand new to Swedenborg. As I say in the intro, I think like never heard of Swedenborg, never heard of Neo-Latin, like doesn't matter. This is like,
Right.
you can be new to both, and this will be an interesting experience of like spiritual exploration. Like if you're interested in sort of these, just inspiring, somewhat mind-bending, and like you say, very touching and sacred feeling. Like when the connection of, we think of words as being truth, but something we touch into a lot in the podcast is how it's so much about feeling, and language is so much about feeling. So there's this whole, it's like a whole body experience to be on this playground together. So it'll be fun to share it with people. And so remember, it's the Latin Playground coming out January 2025. Keep checking your podcast feeds for the Latin Playground. It's coming through the channels, through the interwebs, but it hasn't showed up on my, like when I search on Apple Podcasts, but it's on its way. It's just being, vetted for that distribution. Thanks so much, Jonathan. This was super fun to sit down with you and chat about the Latin Playground, and it makes me excited to get to keep doing it.
Very fun to reflect about it. Thank you.
That's a wrap on the fun of the Latin Playground for now, a production of the Swedenborg Foundation. As a nonprofit, the Swedenborg Foundation depends on the generous giving of donors who find value in the spiritual ideas we've explored here today. Without Latin translation, we wouldn't be able to share what Swedenborg wrote about, and without the funds necessary to financially support Latin translation, we wouldn't be in a position to even know what Swedenborg dedicated his life to putting down on paper in the first place. We need your help. Please consider making a donation to the Dr. Jonathan S. Rose Translation Fund at swedenborg.com/donate. But if you don't have the means at present, your support in the form of liking this podcast, writing a positive review, and sharing it with a friend is as real as cold, hard cash. We hope you'll continue to learn alongside us here on the Latin Playground.